All right, we are at the 4-minute mark after the 1 o'clock stipulated time. I wanted to welcome everyone here for the first inaugural webinar series under Reimagine Cybersecurity. On behalf of the Board of Directors of HIMSS Minnesota, I welcome everyone who has participated and joined here. And we are here to fortunately in the presence of our honorable speaker, Michael Steve. Before getting a great introduction about Mr. Michael Steve, I wanted to quickly go over a few key updates about our chapter, and then we will hand it off to Michael. We will not be able to present this amazing content and collaboration that we have been doing with various Midwest chapters and over here without our key sponsors, who has been very kind and generous to us during this entire process as we grow our chapter, as well as we provide value to our members. So we would like to thank every sponsors who has helped us through this journey. Couple of key chapter updates. We have very recently launched HIMSS Minnesota Heartline. That is our rebranded newsletter, which is designed to be a one-stop document for you with curated information about healthcare IT in the Midwest region. We are planning to release this HIMSS Minnesota Heartline newsletter every month, and you can have that curated content at your hand through email. The second item that I just mentioned about is about reimagining cybersecurity. That's a new vertical that we have heard that there is a demand in there, and we have created. Our goal is to bring the world-class top leaders from cybersecurity domain to share their experience with you. And then I want to quickly mention about the annual Topgolf event. This is going to be a fun event for you and your team to unwind and help us raise money for scholarship to the upcoming healthcare leaders. You can visit and learn more about us in the website, which is mn.himschapter.org. You can also reach out and connect to us and stay informed and join the conversation through our social platform presence in LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. And with that said, and further ado, I would like to introduce our honorable speaker, Michael Steve. He is the founder and executive director of Stanford University School of Engineering and Disruptive Technology and Digital Cities program. He is also an adjunct professor of engineering and president of Transform Innovation in partnership with Stanford faculty. He is a former executive and has 30+ years of experience in this space, and we are fortunate to have him as a speaker today. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing, highlight Mike, and pass it back to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So let me begin by sharing some slides with you. Hold on just a second.
Thank you, Mike.
Hope you all have a good cup of coffee in front of you. Let's see here. Good way to start the day. So just a bit about myself. This session that we're doing.
We're still on your screen in case if you wanted to share. Just wanted to let you know.
Oh, hold on. Here we go. Are we seeing it?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Still getting to learn a little bit about Zoom as we go through all of this year. So I am really pleased to be able to give you some insights in terms of some of the cybersecurity issues that we're beginning to face. And we come from a very particular point of view, which is that of a technologist and business person versus an IT executive. So I hope you'll bear with me on that point. I've had a 35-year career working in various executive roles in technology companies, and then currently I'm doing some work at Stanford in the disruptive technology space. So my experience is primarily around operational issues, where I look at this whole thing as a major problem crossing multiple organizations, everything from looking at IT to engineering and how we actually face a cybersecurity threat. I don't look at it as an IT professional alone, and as such, I have a very different point of view of where the technology is heading. So today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about three major issues, one of which is how do we really understand what is happening in the technology space? So in Silicon Valley, as you can see, we have the center of an ecosystem that has really broad-based exposure to not only software, but specific areas of expertise, including new work in predictive analytics, machine learning and AI, algorithm development, all the way through the circle to hardware, infrastructure, biotech, and behavioral technologies. So this is a vast array of technology at the early stage. So I want to emphasize at the early stage. So when we think about technology development and its impact on cybersecurity, we're thinking about new technologies that are just now becoming available commercially in the marketplace. And so at the center of all this in Silicon Valley and also with Stanford, it's possible for us to take a look at a large array of new technology development and also understand a little bit more about how data is becoming just an explosive element in the mix for protecting our organizations from cyber attack. So let's begin a little bit by talking about this session and what we did. We did a conference for CASEA as part of Leading Authorities speaking engagement. It was a 2-day workshop where we brought in 300 executives. And we talked a little bit about what is happening both on the technology space, but also what they need to be aware of in terms of how cyber attacks are developing, and then what kind of new technology architectures can be used to address it. What was astounding about this session was that the 300 attendees had not really had exposure to the causes of some of the data explosion, but even more fully to understanding how bad actors are beginning to use machine intelligence to be able to attack critical systems. And not just from the point of view of entering a corporate system, but rather accessing a corporate system through consumers and consumer devices. So this session we're going to talk about is only what I would call a tip of the iceberg of the level of detail that we developed for CASEA. So we did a 2-day workshop with them. And we went through in great detail all of these factors, including how to develop a new architecture or approach. So let me begin by giving you kind of a top level overview, and then we're very quickly going to start digging down inside of this to show you what is happening in the cyberspace. This is a chart we use quite frequently to show or illustrate the tracking of technology development, not just in Silicon Valley, but worldwide. It's kind of a crazy chart. It's a series of waves of technology in each area, for example, robotics, predictive analytics. But the thing to know about this is that the technology explosion of devices, of predictive analytics and data is at almost an exponential level of growth. So what does that mean? If you look at this red line, it's a ski slope, literally, and then you look at the dash line represents our ability to manage new technology innovation that is coming to market. The dash line is well below the exponential line, and this gap between the two means that we're seeing a lot of unintended consequences. We're no longer really able to manage the new technologies that are beginning to converge with each other and create new platforms that are what I would call insecure. So part of what we're going to have to face in the future, and we're already facing it today, is that some of the problems we're experiencing in data explosion are really going to be exacerbated in the future by consumer level devices. And policies that we tried to develop to address this had got to, by any sense of the word, involve machine intelligence and artificial intelligence as a defensive mechanism against attacks. So that means that the expertise that's going to be required inside of organizations can no longer be bringing software in to try to solve a particular problem in defending the perimeter of a corporate system without having some machine intelligence and artificial capability to respond to bad actors in that environment. So that means both the strategy and skill set of who we recruit into the corporate environment are going to have to change to be able to adapt to this new explosion of information. So human response time is really at issue here. If you look at the speed of attack, what has changed dramatically in the last several months and years is that machine intelligence in the hands of bad actors is making it possible to launch an attack almost like a weapons platform from everything from consumer products all the way through to corporate. And the response by IT organization is considerably slower. And in many cases, IT organizations are simply not able to keep up with or even identify when an attack has actually occurred anywhere near the speeds that are now being enabled by bad actors. So our human ability to respond parallels that chart I just showed you of the explosion in technology development. And we have to be able to start taking the human out of the element of defense solely, but rather start relying upon new machine intelligence and artificial intelligence to be able to respond to bad actors in millisecond timeframes. So if there's anything we want to really emphasize in the next 40 minutes or so, it's that point. Humans can no longer deal with the speed and breadth of attack that's occurring without having some kind of machine agent, machine intelligence available to address bad actor behavior. So let's talk about three components of today's session. I'm going to give you not just this top level overview of technology we just went through, but also a current state of cybersecurity, where we are today. And that also includes cyber insurance for protection against attack. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a more effective path to prevent attacks in the future. So we already know that data is becoming increasingly a really big issue in terms of both management, but also risk factor. And what is happening if you take the core level of data, that is being dramatically augmented by consumer devices. And the pandemic, if anything, has amplified that the divide between work and home is no longer viable. So we have a lot of work being done in the home with consumer grade protection versus in the office with enterprise grade protection. And that is creating a major issue because the number of people who can access corporate platforms from the home is increasing pretty dramatically. Secondly, consumer devices, IoT devices of all different types are now able to access information crossing multiple systems. As an example of that, just in the banking community alone, it's possible to have a cyber attack launched on a consumer platform like a video game that accesses banking information, account information, and personal ID without consumers even knowing what is happening. So part of this whole issue that we've been dealing with traditionally with data, we're seeing IoT devices and consumers throwing literally a monkey wrench into the machinery. And the pandemic has amplified that pretty dramatically. The amount of data that is being generated by consumer devices is extraordinary. And so we're looking at 1.7 megabytes per second for every person historically in 2020. And that number is nearly doubling in the next 2 years. So this whole issue of looking at data is becoming critical for the company. So the second point after machine intelligence is that the data itself is a major problem. It's not just what we archive, but it's the data in motion that we are beginning to have to manage as part of the perimeter for our both corporate and consumer systems. So let me dig a little bit down into this for the healthcare market specifically. What's very interesting about this is that the healthcare market is changing pretty dramatically in terms of the use of consumer devices and mobile applications. We now are able to do video appointments at home. We're also sharing information from the home to the healthcare organization. And in addition to that, we have a whole range of devices. I'm wearing, for example, my Apple Watch, which has an oximeter. It has the ability to read my heart rate, track the kind of exercise routines, et cetera. But those devices now are so broad-based that the information that is being accumulated is really having an impact on the data piece of managing healthcare systems. My own doctor, an internist, is now trying to accumulate iWatch data to add to his corporate information that he has in his system to help track my health. And so we've got this mix and match of information and data that's coming from multiple sources that we haven't had before. Researchers have found that healthcare data is projected not only to grow faster than any other vertical segment, but that it will have a compound annual growth rate approaching 36% through the next several years. And so this digital transformation that's taking place is really important for us to observe because it will have cost implications for the healthcare business. I recently gave a keynote to the board of directors of a major Midwest healthcare system. And the major issue that they were facing is that the IT department is so heavily involved in just trying to maintain legacy-based systems. They really didn't know what to do about how to prepare for this future of having both IoT devices and personal devices involved in the medical mix for subscribers. And so it's really becoming a problem because we are cutting the budget for many IT organizations, but we're also relying upon what I would call legacy-based systems to protect our information when in fact, this new advent of devices coming into the marketplace is having a huge impact on all of that. As an example, I just bought a toothbrush and the toothbrush now is connected to the iPhone. And so I'm one of those people that's actually creating the problem for everyone else because I use the data extensively to help improve my own healthcare and have absolutely no clue where the information is being used. And so as a consumer, I have no real understanding of how to secure information. I have a privacy statement from Apple for using the watch. I have a privacy statement on the iPhone, but I don't have any kind of cybersecurity information to tell me how to protect my own data. So this is a huge problem for us to be able to address because it will impact overall our healthcare systems. And these devices are becoming more pervasive. In a sense, they're good that they help reduce cost, but they also have a double-edged sword of also producing new data that has to be managed somewhere along the value chain. So the challenge that we previously had with this explosion in information is that we have a lot of unstructured Dart, I would even call unfathomable and expensively maintained information. And the percentage of information that is generated that is now characterized as dark and unseen is now approaching 50%, which is crazy. And the data that is being unstructured means not only can we not get the kind of deliberative insights that we were looking for, but almost 90% of the data has been just created in the last 2 years. A really crazy conundrum to try to manage. So we have to somehow, the third bullet point, develop a weed and feed program to tackle this problem. And so we have not just the notion of trying to understand machine intelligence for bad actors, the role of consumer data, the second bullet point, but now we also have the need to do a weed and feed program that allows us to get rid of bad information, or at least move it into archival, which is still expensive to maintain. But we also need to have an understanding of how to gain insight from the new consumer information that's also moving into some of these corporate systems. So the cost of this is really enormous. Some estimate as much as $3 trillion yearly for the poor data quality management and growing. It's not going to be sustainable. We will not have the ability to sustain this long term. So as a case example, how does this apply to the healthcare industry? We have a fairly big problem in that we estimate that 20% of healthcare costs are now indirectly attributed to poor data management. Now, keep in mind, this is just data management. It does not include other major issues, including the ability to put up new defensive technologies using machine speed and intelligence. So 20% of the cost structure. So if we were concerned about trying to drive down cost, just the management of data alone is a big factor that we need to address, let alone cybersecurity and risk issues. The number of cyber breaches that is reported, at least in the last several years, has hit record levels. And because machine intelligence is able to penetrate a lot of our defenses, we can expect that this number is going to continue at a very high rate of growth. Everybody understands the issue about data breaches, but what we don't see is this is actually a tip of the iceberg. This is a tip of the iceberg because a lot of data breaches or penetrations of systems, in many cases, are simply not reported to the full extent. Not only that, but also ransomware attacks. So one of the major recommendations that we need to start thinking about is how do we get government supervision to assure that when a data breach actually occurs, it's possible for us to be able to track and understand the impact overall to our businesses. The second major area that we need to be concerned about is the current state of cybersecurity, what's actually happening there. But before I go on, let me just summarize the previous section. So what we're basically saying is, at very top level, this basic explosion in innovation that's occurring, everything from sensor devices rather, generating data, all the way through to new consumer technology, is driving this huge explosion in consumer data that is now impinging upon our corporate perimeters. And the pandemic has created a major acceleration and amplification of the problem because of the erasure of the traditional homework divide. And yet the systems that we have in place, something as simple as advising a consumer about how to protect themselves, is simply not really very effective. And so the whole point of the first section is this is not going to stop. The amount of money that is being invested in new technology development hit a record level last year. To give you some sense of this, all of the corporate 1,000 companies in the world spent about $2 trillion in R&D and about $200 billion, less than 10%, on what I would call new innovative technologies. On the other side of it, over $300 billion was spent in the development of joint ventures for startups, venture funding, commercial labs, and government projects. So in other words, the technologies that are being developed at early stage are literally exploding because of the massive investment that is being made across all realms of $300 billion. So it's not going to go away. If anything, this acceleration is going to create this double-edged sword of opportunity on the one hand to create the new Googles and Amazons, but also on the other side of it, breaching data that is being generated because it's not being properly managed. Now, I don't know how to characterize this other than that we have a similar explosion in problems that have developed in cybersecurity, crossing every major realm. The institutes, so some of the research institutes are basically saying that we don't capture when an attack has occurred until a long time after the event. And it becomes almost impossible to take any action to remediate it without some kind of cost delivery. And so this goes back to the notion that we have human beings trying to manage this, and we don't have enough machine intelligence, AI capability to match the speed of development of bad actors. And the other thing that we use as a terminology here in our presentation is the idea of a weapons platform. So bad actors are looking at everything from video games to consumer platforms as weapons platforms, which means that they are able to float a botnet into a platform in a very unseemingly menacing way to be able to create entry into both personal and corporate systems. The dark market for buying botnets is pretty astonishing in the way that it's grown. We can now buy a botnet for 35 bucks. And in many cases, my grandson, as an example of that, who is a gamer, is telling me that they're now offering botnets as a way to help pay for subscription services. And which is kind of curious. I didn't even know that he was handing access to this. So it's a big problem that we have to start thinking about, in addition to what I will call the cleanup bills of breaches that have occurred that we haven't been able to remediate. And so this reaction time of how to secure data is really critical to all of this. So how do we actually start thinking about the threat landscape and the early adoption of technologies beyond SOAR that will allow for us to be able to address some of these issues? Well, it's interesting because an average IT organization has roughly 70 different tools employed for security, some of which are incompatible with each other. So just like we have to weed and feed data to understand how to get rid of dark information and retain insight information, we have to do the same thing in terms of assessing an inventory of tools that we're using and really trying to assess how effective they are at being able to protect our perimeter. This whole key path to solution about machine intelligence, the very first bullet point that we made, is super important. And it also is very difficult for an IT executive to explain. So in the case example of the keynote where we were talking to a hospital, in the Midwest, the board wanted to know how do they actually explain this need to develop this kind of expertise to their own IT organization. And in talking to their own IT organization, the problem came up that they don't actually know how to recruit the right people with the right expertise to bring in, nor do they know how to actually explain this to their own management team. So one of the things we came away with out of that board discussion was the need to have a communication strategy to manage up. And some of these IT executives that we've been talking to over the last year have done just that. They have started to educate boards and their management team on the need to take a different approach to how we protect ourselves from cyber attacks. And the key path to that solution is really understanding where machine intelligence can apply. Now, the university, where we have labs that focus on machine intelligence and cutting edge AI for cyber, we are dealing with technologies that are 18 to 36 months from the marketplace. So it's very difficult to find the tools, the necessary tools, in any kind of broad-based way that are available that we can use today. But there are a couple of case examples of companies that are developing that, especially startup companies. So part of what we need to do is to really do a reassessment, to take a breathing space away from the normal problems of the IT organization and really start thinking about how do we do an assessment of what we have in our war against bad actors, and how do we take the human out of the loop. The other thing that's beginning to happen is we have insurance companies that are having real problems providing insurance longer term that's sustainable for cybersecurity events. And there's actually a simple reason for this. If the bad actors are moving at machine speed and they're attacking data in motion, insurance companies are using old, time worn out ideas about how to set premiums and pricing based on fixed information. So the problem is that the insurance tools actually can't keep up to do the evaluation of data in motion and what it's valued at as information is moving through a system. So they can't accurately assess risk because they don't have the necessary technology and tools to be able to do this. So as a result of this, cyber prices the premiums are beginning to soar. We had a 25% increase just in Q2, and they're not only hiking premium prices, but they're reducing coverage at the same time. If this keeps up, we're going to be looking at a insurance business that is, for all intents and purposes, out of money and out of ability to do protection in the long term. So this is a early warning of a problem set that we have to deal with in order to be able to have long-term sustainability and protection in case we do get breached. Lastly, what are some of the more effective paths to prevent attacks? Well, I think we have to get to this concept of zero trust. I know it's a generic term. Sometimes it doesn't seem to mean much in terms of practice, but we really need to get to the point where zero trust includes consumer platforms from the home, not just corporate platforms. And we also need to think about these new platforms as weapons delivery systems. So I'm going to use a military term to describe what the threat is. Not only do we have botnets being sold in the black market, but we also have this whole confusion of the line between work and home and play. As an example of that, several of IT executives have discussed the fact that their own children have been breached unknowingly, information in the home for work through their systems. So this is something that is going to become, I think, an increasingly important issue that we need to really think about. How do we prevent and secure consumer devices and consumer home work as securely as we do in the offices? But even in the offices, we're not that secure because we still have breaches that are occurring as a result of machine level attacks. This is an orchestration of, I would call an evolution map of the stages to increase protection, compliments of one of our members of the Stanford program. And so you can look at these stages. These are industry terminologies. As you dig underneath all of this, you have multiple tools at your disposal, but not all organizations can figure out how to create a path like this that's not within their budget constraints or they're in their expertise. So then how would we start thinking about an approach? Step by step, well, assess your current data and skills identification in the company. We talked about the weed and feed program on how we have 50% dark data. We also talked about the legacy issues of using current tools in IT that are really not that helpful in terms of being able to track millisecond attacks. We do need now to start thinking about a budget assessment for cyber, new cyber tools. And that also includes a new set of expertise to recruit people who understand machine level programming and algorithm development. The other issue as we start going through all this is algorithm development has to become a new expertise within the cyber organization to prevent attacks. Algorithm development and using advanced tools to generate insights and then prevent packet level intercepts is super important as part of the overall strategy. So all this means change, and it's dramatic, and it can be very painful for corporations. And so whatever we do in terms of understanding how to deal with the reality, remember that first curve that I showed you, which is that this explosion is moving very, very rapidly, and our ability to keep up with it is increasingly difficult using legacy-based systems. So our organizations are going to have to become much more adaptable to change. And so you're going to have to think about that in terms of who you recruit and who you are putting in assigned to manage some of these issues inside corporate organizations. So on the desired platform steps, we have a detailed session that we do which goes through all the particulars about architecture and how this all works. We don't have the time to do that today, but we can certainly provide some of that information for you if you'd like to read through it. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and open this up for questions. I hope this was informative. Remember, it's a technologist point of view. So these are my opinions, my colleagues' opinions. I'm not an IT executive. And so I see early stage technology developing, but I'm not a person who has the responsibility inside of an organization to help with defensive strategies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was very informative and pretty impressive breadth and depth of research that you have done across the industry that you have shared from a perspective standpoint. Before we get to the Q&A session, I just wanted to quickly introduce and play a 80 seconds video of a company called CloudShare, which I have learned is the board of advisor of the Stanford innovation ecosystem as a whole, as well as they are playing in the space where they're really willing to help ecosystem in the HIMSS aspect, healthcare aspect, and beyond through our cybersecurity defense journey. So I'm going to quickly share.
Before we begin,
before
we begin that, I just want to make it clear that Stanford does not endorse any particular solutions. We're a nonprofit university, and so we're neutral as far as any. We don't do endorsements. Thank you
so much, Michael. Really appreciate that.
Today's rapidly changing cyber landscape demands AI-based defense tools that inspect, analyze, react, and report cyber threats in real time to ensure effective, dynamic, continuous protection. CloudCover has eclipsed the latest generation of security extended detection response solutions. CloudCover's B1 employs advanced security orchestration, automation, and response capabilities, with AI-driven, real-time risk neutralizing the threat in microseconds. B1 is an agnostic extended SOAR platform that augments existing security environments by introducing mathematics into the network and thereby controlling all security devices and protocols, extending to the IoT edge. B1 ledgers risk-scored IT events onto a blockchain to further establish tamper-proof transparency for forensic inspection, compliance auditing, and our patented cyber risk underwriting that include cloud-based network embedded data insurance, utilizing auto adjudication and micro-settlement. With microsecond speed, accuracy, and today embedded cybersecurity data insurance, the B1 platform is years ahead of the security industry. Visit cloudcover.cc or contact your IT provider and ask for the CloudCover B1 platform.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity of staying over and look at that video as well. As the questions are coming in, and I would again encourage all the registrants and people who are present here to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions. We will try to address them as we progress, and hopefully Michael will be able to share his experience and knowledge about this space and help us. As we go with the first question, I do have a question that I wanted to open this forum up with, Michael, if that's okay, and then we can go deeper in the questions from the audience as well.
Sure.
So, I mean, obviously with the growth of data in the healthcare space, and you're, probably expanding the space about using and leveraging consumer tech, IoT devices, and the landscape, exponentially increasing, we understand where the different data sources coming in. Now, institutions like us, like Mayo Clinic, similarly various other institutions, which really approaches cybersecurity as the first principle approach and try to embed the process through development, through operations, and through everything. But there are institutions who are similarly under the healthcare space, but may not have the level of sophistication or awareness how to really approach these challenges going forward. So what would you suggest to those individual institutions or beyond, or small practices to approach this problem and where they should start, and how would they prioritize?
That's a great question. Are you asking it of me or the general audience?
I am asking of you to provide your perspective, if that's okay.
So I can give the example of a small medical practice, or I can go also to the large hospital, for example, or hospital chain. So for the small player, it's very difficult because of cost issues. It's even difficult to try to understand the implications of all this. So as an example, in one particular doctor's office, they're encouraging the use of consumer devices, but they don't actually understand the threat that poses when the data is coming across for their own use. These are doctors, they're not business people, nor are they IT executives. And so for them, they really are focusing on the value equation, the value of the devices and what they can do, provide better healthcare monitoring. So they're not looking at the other end of it. So they're going to have to rely on companies out there to provide them with some kind of a service to help them understand the exposure. And it has to be reasonably affordable because of their budgets. So one example, data coming in from my iWatch into a doctor's system. He has a service that basically stores all medical information, and he doesn't have any path except to manually enter that information directly into his data records. So he doesn't track where it came from per se, but what he does do is he tries to understand it from a medical point of view. So if I've got a cardiogram, he characterizes that as a Apple Watch versus in-office routine. But he doesn't differentiate when the data was received. He doesn't differentiate. He hasn't done any protection to understand if I am actually who I am. Let's say I am. So that's a big issue for the small and medium-sized businesses. For large organizations, the biggest problem is getting out of the way of legacy systems. It's a different problem.
Sure.
They are fully capable of being able to make change occur, but we have legacy systems that are in place that cost a lot of money to maintain. And you have just a basic lack of understanding about what new skill sets or what new tools are required. So I would say it's super important from a management point of view to have the board of directors exposed to some of this new information so they can understand what level of support from a budget point of view is needed for their own organizations. Secondly, it's not particularly easy to recruit what I would call highly talented algorithm specialists, for example. And so compensation becomes another major issue, which is how do we actually compensate, assuming we can recruit these people in the right way, how do we compensate and motivate them within our own organization? Interestingly enough, at one of the board meetings where we had an HR representative, the biggest problem they have is they don't want to have inconsistent HR guidelines. It's more important from a process point of view for them to have consistent compensation than it is actually to make an exception to the rule to figure out how to compensate a highly talented individual. And that really is going to get in the way.
Sure.
So our own corporate systems and our own corporate cultures are kind of a barrier in this. So the only way to really break through that is at the top level manager. You've got to have some board level involvement. So I've encouraged boards also to bring on board a technologist, not an IT person per se, but rather a technologist who has exposure to some of this, the new systems, even somebody who has a venture background.
Sure. Or maybe the term that I call it as techno-optimist, who really thinks that technology can solve real life problem and we can solve it in a better manner and good for everyone. And that's kind of an important aspect to understand being a techno-optimist and how important it is to have a spot at the board so that, those risks can be discussed as deep as needed. Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate that. I'll move on to the next question that I see a colleague and a friend of mine asking, part of the PCI collaboration group that we who are primarily focusing on the PCI data classification, we share a forum. So Jason Banner is asking that, obviously we talked about IoT, we talked about AI and ML and how data lakes is expanding as a whole, but how is blockchain considered to be a threat landscape, which is emergingly creating certain problem in this space as a whole, specifically for healthcare as well as beyond?
Well, blockchain, in my opinion, is a generic term. You really have to get underneath the hood, so to speak, to understand what it is you want to do and what tools are going to be effective and which ones are not. So blockchain always comes up in these discussions that we have through the keynotes. The problem with it is that you can only go so far before people begin to not really understand what blockchain involves in terms of architecture development and application to their own systems. And so we go right back to the same problem. New expertise, and you have to have on board some ability to understand how the architecture is going to provide a solution for your own organization. So, when a system like UCSD, for example, medical system, one of the larger ones in Southern California, or UCSF up in San Francisco, when they start thinking about this, they're thinking about it as a planning horizon, meaning that they're beginning to understand what the fundamental expertise is required to really deal with blockchain applications. And they're looking for examples that are simply not just test examples, but real world applications. So, and then building upon that, bring it in gradually and testing it for different applications within the hospital system. So it's almost like we are, it's something that we really don't have a grasp of understanding. And it's something that we have to kind of test out and go, one step at a time.
Sure. No, that's a great way to look at blockchain as a whole, as it is a emergent technology, even if it has some inherent way of protecting the data and how that exchange of information is happening and exchange of value is happening. As a whole, we have less awareness about where things can be applied and how it can be applied, and we do not know what data exchange is happening and if new sets of data classification are being evolving through that process. So absolutely, we'll have to take a grain of salt, yet we need to know that this is an unknown that we need to go deeper and develop new expertise. And maybe like the algorithm engineers and algorithm developer, we in a healthcare community need to start looking at somebody who is well versed with the blockchain ecosystem as well, and bring that expertise here, because it does have the true potential to solve quite a bit of complex problems that we have in existing in healthcare, specifically in a local and a domestic space, and as well as we do integration and interface outside of the domestic space.
The other thing that I would also encourage organizations to do is to examine cost impact of all this, not just from the point of view of new tool development, but rather how much cost savings can we develop out of these applications. Quite frequently, we'll adopt new technologies without really understanding if they're going to have a positive impact to reduce cost. So right at the very beginning, no matter what I've seen in terms of successful adoption of technology is, you have organizations that take a look at it from the point of view of cost reduction to see what impact it can make. And that actually starts to provide some kind of prioritization on where you want to invest.
Sure. Makes sense. Fair enough. We'll quickly move on to the next question that I see in the chat is, how do you think the current events of the day will impact the challenges that you highlighted today in the cybersecurity space?
Are we talking about impacts of today as in what's happening in Europe?
I would say that in that ecosystem as a whole, in that geolocation.
Well, this is a really tough question. I believe that when you have sophisticated military capability versus bad actors who are not military, you have far more advanced ability to be able to disable systems. And we're relying upon our own defense establishment to figure out whether or not we have effective tools. And I would go right back to the same problems that millisecond attack and botnets. It's the same major issue, but on a much more grander scale. I would suspect that if I were a betting man, that something major will happen as a result of the sanctions that are being deployed against Russia. And they are quite a capable actor should they decide they want to have a cyber attack against the United States and its allies. So I would expect something to happen. I hope I'm wrong.
All right, well, that's great. Any other questions from the audience here? Please use the Q&A feature or the chat feature if you ask any questions that you would like Michael and myself to quickly discuss before we adjourn our session today. Michael, anything from your perspective that you want to mention before we
No,
jump?
I think we have covered the gamut. If anyone's interested in talking about a more in-depth workshop, we do offer a 2-day cybersecurity workshop through leading authorities. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate your time today. And thanks for all those participants for joining and listening to us. This webinar and session was recorded and will be available under the HIMSS Minnesota website, which you can review all the archived ones. Also, this is uploaded on our YouTube channel and shared through LinkedIn. So please stay tuned to those social platforms to learn more about upcoming events, as well as look at this recording or view this recording asynchronously. I wish everyone a great rest of the week. Have a great rest of the afternoon as well. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.